Thaddeus Stevens was a Pennsylvania lawyer and fierce abolitionist who became one of the most powerful voices for equality in American history. Thaddeus Stevens, the radical Republican congressman, was born in Danville, Vermont on April 4, 1792. He came from humble beginnings. He had a clubfoot that marked him from birth. Stevens's family struggled with poverty throughout his childhood. He was educated despite his family's financial hardships, attending Dartmouth College where he graduated in 1814. When he left Vermont, he moved to Pennsylvania to start his career as a teacher and then as a lawyer. In 1816, his mother's sacrifices to educate him paid off and the young Stevens established a law practice in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Thaddeus Stevens never married, though he maintained a long relationship with his housekeeper Lydia Hamilton Smith, a mixed-race woman. In the 1820s, when slavery was deeply embedded in American society, Stevens began defending fugitive slaves without charge. He risked his reputation and his safety to protect those fleeing bondage. Stevens was drawn into politics by his fierce opposition to slavery and his belief in equal rights for all men. In 1833, Stevens was elected to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. He fought against the expansion of slavery into new territories. He championed public education, believing that free schools were essential to democracy. Stevens helped establish Pennsylvania's public school system in the 1830s despite fierce opposition from those who didn't want to pay taxes for education. He was a master debater in the state legislature. His sharp tongue and sharper mind made him feared by his opponents. Stevens left the state legislature in 1841, but his passion for justice never wavered. He continued his law practice and became increasingly wealthy from his investments in iron manufacturing. The ironworks he owned employed both white and black workers at a time when such integration was virtually unheard of. In 1848, Stevens was elected to the United States House of Representatives as a member of the Whig Party. He arrived in Washington as a committed opponent of slavery in any form. Stevens was not a moderate or a compromiser on the question of human bondage. He believed slavery was a moral evil that had to be destroyed root and branch. In Congress, Stevens opposed the Compromise of 1850, which allowed slavery to potentially expand into territories acquired from Mexico. He denounced the Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northerners to return escaped slaves to their masters. Stevens called it a betrayal of American principles of liberty and justice. His speeches on the House floor were legendary for their eloquence and their fury. He didn't simply argue against slavery on economic or political grounds. He attacked it as a sin against God and humanity. Stevens served in Congress until 1853, when he temporarily left politics, frustrated by the growing power of pro-slavery forces. But he couldn't stay away from the fight. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which threatened to extend slavery into new territories, brought Stevens back into the political arena. He joined the newly formed Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery. In 1858, Stevens was re-elected to Congress as a Republican. He would serve in the House of Representatives for the rest of his life, becoming one of the most powerful men in Washington. Stevens was older now, in his 60s, but his fire for justice burned hotter than ever. He became chairman of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, which controlled government spending. This position gave him enormous influence over national policy. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the Southern states began to secede from the Union. Stevens had no sympathy for the secessionists. He believed they were traitors who should be treated as such. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Stevens immediately saw it as an opportunity not just to preserve the Union but to destroy slavery forever. He pushed Lincoln to make the war about emancipation from the very beginning. Lincoln was more cautious, wanting to keep the border states in the Union and not alienate Northern Democrats who supported the war but not abolition. Stevens grew impatient with Lincoln's gradualism. He wanted immediate emancipation and the arming of black soldiers to fight for their own freedom. As chairman of Ways and Means, Stevens controlled the purse strings for the war effort. He helped finance the massive military buildup that would eventually crush the Confederacy. Stevens supported the Legal Tender Act, which created paper money called greenbacks to pay for the war. He pushed through tax increases, including the first income tax in American history, to fund the Union Army. Stevens understood that winning the war required resources, and he was willing to use the full power of the federal government to marshal those resources. He didn't care about states' rights or limited government when it came to destroying slavery and preserving the Union. Stevens believed in using federal power to achieve justice and equality. In 1862, President Lincoln finally issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in the rebel states. Stevens applauded the move but thought it didn't go far enough. He wanted a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery everywhere in the United States. He wanted the government to confiscate the property of rebel slaveholders and redistribute it to the freed slaves. Stevens believed that freedom without economic independence was meaningless. He proposed giving every freed family 40 acres of land taken from the plantations of Confederate leaders. This was too radical even for most Republicans, and the plan was never implemented. But Stevens never stopped fighting for economic justice for the free people. Stevens was instrumental in passing the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States. The amendment passed Congress in January 1865, and Stevens celebrated it as the greatest achievement of his life. But he knew that ending slavery was just the first step. The freed people needed protection, education, and economic opportunity. As the Civil War ended in April 1865 with the surrender of Confederate forces, Stevens began planning for Reconstruction. He wanted to transform the South into a society based on equality and justice. He didn't want to simply restore the Union as it had been before the war. He wanted to create a new Union where black and white citizens had equal rights under law. Then President Lincoln was assassinated on April 14, 1865, just days after the war ended. Andrew Johnson, the vice president, became president. Johnson was a Tennessee Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, but he had no sympathy for black equality. Johnson wanted to quickly restore the Southern states to the Union with minimal changes to their social structure. He pardoned thousands of former Confederates and allowed them to regain political power. Stevens was horrified by Johnson's lenient policies toward the South. He watched as Southern states passed black codes that restricted the freedom of former slaves and kept them in a condition close to slavery. Stevens knew that without federal intervention the fruits of Union victory would be lost. Stevens became the leader of the radical Republicans in Congress who opposed Johnson's Reconstruction policies. He was now in his 70s, but his energy and determination were undiminished. Stevens argued that the Confederate states had committed suicide by seceding and should be treated as conquered territories. He believed Congress, not the president, should control Reconstruction policy. In 1866, Stevens helped pass the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto. The act granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States and guaranteed equal protection under the law. It was a revolutionary piece of legislation that challenged centuries of racial hierarchy. Stevens also helped create the Freedmen's Bureau, which provided food, education, and legal assistance to former slaves. But Stevens wanted more permanent protections for black rights. He was the driving force behind the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which guaranteed citizenship and equal protection to all persons born in the United States. The amendment passed Congress in 1866, and Stevens worked tirelessly to secure its ratification by the states. He knew that constitutional amendments were harder to overturn than ordinary laws. The 14th Amendment became one of the most important additions to the Constitution, providing the legal foundation for civil rights for generations to come. Stevens didn't live to see all of its promise fulfilled, but he understood its significance. The conflict between Congress and President Johnson intensified throughout 1866 and 1867. Johnson vetoed bill after bill designed to protect the rights of free people. Congress overrode his vetoes again and again. Stevens was at the center of these battles, using his parliamentary skills and political cunning to outmaneuver the president. In March 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts over Johnson's veto. These acts divided the South into military districts and required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment and grant black men the right to vote before they could be readmitted to the Union. It was a radical transformation of Southern society imposed by federal power. Stevens had pushed for even harsher measures, including the confiscation of rebel property, but he accepted this as a significant victory. President Johnson continued to obstruct congressional reconstruction at every turn. He removed military commanders who enforced the Reconstruction Acts too vigorously. He encouraged Southern whites to resist federal authority. Stevens and other radical Republicans decided that Johnson had to be removed from office. In February 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Andrew Johnson. Thaddeus Stevens, now 76 years old and in failing health, was one of the managers of the impeachment trial in the Senate. He had to be carried into the Senate chamber because he was too weak to walk. But his mind was still sharp and his commitment to justice unwavering. Stevens argued that Johnson had violated the law and betrayed his oath of office by obstructing Reconstruction. The impeachment trial was a dramatic confrontation between the legislative and executive branches. In May 1868, the Senate voted on whether to remove Johnson from office. The vote was 35-19 for conviction, just one vote short of the two-thirds majority required for removal. Johnson remained president, but his power was broken. Stevens was disappointed by the outcome, but he had succeeded in neutering Johnson's ability to undermine Reconstruction. The impeachment sent a message that Congress would not tolerate presidential obstruction of civil rights. By the summer of 1868, Thaddeus Stevens was dying. He had devoted his entire life to the cause of equality and justice. He had fought slavery when it was unpopular and dangerous to do so. He had helped win the Civil War and end slavery forever. He had pushed for constitutional amendments protecting the rights of all citizens. He had battled presidents and powerful interests to secure a measure of justice for the free people. Stevens knew his work was unfinished. He knew that white supremacy was deeply rooted in American society and would not be easily overcome. He worried that without continued federal protection, the gains of Reconstruction would be lost. His fears would prove prophetic. On August 11, 1868, Thaddeus Stevens died in Washington. He was 76 years old. In his will, he requested to be buried in a cemetery that accepted people of all races. He wanted his final resting place to reflect his lifelong commitment to equality. His gravestone in Lancaster, Pennsylvania bears an inscription he wrote himself: "I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited by charter rules as to race, I have chosen this that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life, equality of man before his Creator." Even in death, Stevens was making a statement about justice and human dignity. Stevens's legacy is complex and contested. To his supporters, he was a fearless champion of human rights who fought for the most oppressed people in American society. He used his political power to advance the cause of equality when most white Americans were indifferent or hostile to black rights. He helped write the constitutional amendments that provided the legal foundation for the civil rights movement a century later. Without Stevens and the radical Republicans, the 13th and 14th Amendments might never have been passed. These amendments transformed the Constitution from a document that protected slavery into one that promised equal citizenship for all. To his critics, Stevens was a vindictive radical who wanted to punish the South and impose racial equality by force. They accused him of corruption in his business dealings and of hypocrisy for living with a black woman while never publicly acknowledging their relationship. Some historians have portrayed Stevens as a dangerous extremist whose harsh Reconstruction policies poisoned relations between North and South for generations. But this criticism often comes from those who opposed racial equality and wanted to minimize the changes brought by the Civil War. Stevens understood that ending slavery required a fundamental transformation of Southern society, and he was willing to use federal power to achieve that transformation. Modern historians have generally been more sympathetic to Stevens and the radical Republicans. They recognize that Stevens was fighting for principles that were far ahead of his time. He believed in racial equality when most white Americans believed in white supremacy. He believed in using government power to protect the rights of the weak against the strong. He believed that democracy required not just political rights but also economic opportunity. His vision of a multiracial democracy based on equality before the law would not be realized in his lifetime. Reconstruction collapsed in the 1870s as Northern whites lost interest in protecting black rights and Southern whites used violence and intimidation to restore white supremacy. The failure of Reconstruction led to nearly a century of Jim Crow segregation in the South. Black Americans were denied the vote, relegated to inferior schools, and subjected to systematic discrimination and violence. The promise of the 14th Amendment was betrayed as the Supreme Court interpreted it narrowly and refused to protect black rights. It would take the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s to revive the radical Republican vision of equality. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Thurgood Marshall invoked the 14th Amendment and the principles of Reconstruction in their fight against segregation. They were, in a sense, completing the work that Thaddeus Stevens had begun. Stevens's commitment to equality extended beyond race. He was a champion of public education for all children regardless of their economic background. He believed that democracy required an educated citizenry and that the government had an obligation to provide free schools. His work establishing Pennsylvania's public school system in the 1830s was as important as his later work on Reconstruction. Stevens understood that political rights were meaningless without the education needed to exercise them effectively. He also supported women's property rights and other reforms that expanded individual liberty. What made Stevens such an effective political leader was his combination of moral conviction and practical political skill. He was a true believer in equality, but he was also a shrewd politician who knew how to count votes and make deals. He could be ruthless in pursuing his goals, using his control of congressional committees to reward allies and punish enemies. He was willing to compromise on tactics while never compromising on principles. Stevens understood that politics was about power, and he was willing to use power to achieve justice. This made him different from some abolitionists who were pure in their principles but ineffective in achieving practical results. Stevens's personal life remained somewhat mysterious. He never married and lived for many years with Lydia Hamilton Smith, his housekeeper. Smith was a light-skinned black woman who managed his household and his business affairs. The nature of their relationship has been debated by historians. Some believe they were lovers, others that they were simply close friends and business partners. Stevens never publicly discussed his relationship with Smith, and she remained discreet about their private life. What is clear is that Stevens trusted Smith completely and relied on her judgment. When he died, he left her a substantial portion of his estate. Stevens's clubfoot was a defining feature of his life. He was self-conscious about his disability and wore a wig to cover his baldness. Some historians have speculated that his physical disabilities made him sympathetic to others who were marginalized and oppressed. He knew what it was like to be marked as different and to face discrimination. This personal experience may have fueled his passion for equality and justice. Stevens never let his disabilities limit his ambitions or his effectiveness. He was a powerful public speaker despite his physical limitations, and he commanded respect through the force of his intellect and his moral authority. The ironworks that Stevens owned were attacked and burned by Confederate forces during the Gettysburg Campaign in 1863. The destruction of his property cost him thousands of dollars, but Stevens never sought compensation from the government. He saw his personal losses as a small price to pay for the cause of union and emancipation. The burning of his ironworks only strengthened his determination to punish the rebellion and transform Southern society. Stevens believed that the Confederate leadership should pay for the destruction they had caused and that their property should be confiscated and redistributed to the free people. Thaddeus Stevens died before he could see whether his vision of Reconstruction would succeed or fail. In the years immediately after his death, it seemed that the radical Republicans might achieve their goals. Black men voted and held office throughout the South. Integrated schools were established in some areas. The federal government used military force to protect black rights against white violence. But this progress was fragile and temporary. As federal troops were withdrawn from the South in the 1870s, white supremacists used terrorism and fraud to overthrow Reconstruction governments. By 1877, Reconstruction was effectively over and the promise of equality was betrayed. Yet Stevens's work was not in vain. The constitutional amendments he helped pass remained on the books even when they were not enforced. They provided the legal tools that future generations would use to fight for civil rights. The 14th Amendment in particular became the basis for landmark Supreme Court decisions like Brown v. Board of Education, which outlawed school segregation. Stevens's vision of a multiracial democracy based on equality before the law eventually triumphed, even though it took a century longer than he had hoped. His life stands as a testament to the power of moral conviction and political courage in the face of overwhelming opposition.